Lesson 117 is about finding a whole when a fraction is known. Okay, so we've definitely had problems where we've maybe said 2/3 of 60 dogs were white. Okay, something like that. How many dogs were white? But now we're going to have like a missing number. So let's look at our first problem. It says 2/5 of the runners in a race are warming up. If 10 runners are warming up, how many runners are in the race? So I just wrote down some of the information here. We know 2/5 of runners are warming up, and we know that 2/5 of all the runners that are warming up is 10 runners. Okay, so now what we have to do is take this information and change it from words to numbers and symbols. So 2/5 is already a number, so I can just write that down. Of, what does of mean in math? It means multiply. Runners, so that represents all of the runners that are in the race. Okay, so that's the number we don't know. That's the number we're looking for. So I'm going to replace that with a variable. And 2/5 of all the runners in the race is 10 runners. Is means equals. Okay, so the question is, normally when we have equations like that, we would say, let's say we had 2 times an unknown number equals 10. We would divide both sides by 2, and our unknown number would be 5 in this case. But in this situation, we are using a fraction. Well, that's okay. We can still divide with fractions, but we have to remember what division is. Division with fractions, we multiply by the reciprocal, because anytime we multiply a fraction by its reciprocal, we get 1. And that's our goal, is to get a 1 in front of that variable. So if we multiply both sides by the reciprocal, then we can just be left with 1x. So x equals, and now we can cross cancel. Our 10 becomes 5, and our 2 becomes a 1. So x equals 25 runners. So if you think about it, we're saying 2/5 of all the runners, so 2/5 of 25 is 10 runners. And you can check it, and let's just check it. 2/5 of 25 equals 10. Well, this becomes a 1, this becomes a 5, and we know that 2 times 5 is 10, so it checks out. Let's look at the next one. 6 is 2/3 of what number? So once again, let's translate what we have. 6 is already a number. We don't have to do anything to that. Is means what in math? Equals 2/3 of, we already said was multiply, and what number? That's what we represent with some sort of a variable. You can use an X, you can use a Y, you could use a W, you could use an N, whatever you want. I like to use X's. So once again, in order to get rid of that 2/3 that's attached to the variable, okay, because that's always what we're trying to get rid of, is anything that's attached to the variable, what we have to do is multiply by the reciprocal. And it's okay that they're not right next to each other. Okay, we can still multiply across over that x. So those all become 1. And we have to multiply this by the reciprocal, which is 3/2. And the 2 becomes a 1, the 6 becomes a 3, and we find out that our unknown number is 9. So 6 is 2/3 of 9. All right, the next lesson, I'm only going to do those 2, and I'd like for y'all to try the rest on your own. The next lesson, 118, is about estimating area. And we've done this before. If you aren't sure about what, if you have some strange kind of shape, you can simply put it on a grid and do your best to count up the number of squares represented by that grid. So that's what you're going to do for these two practice problems, and I'm going to let you guys do those on your own because I think it's important. Lesson 119 is about finding a hole when a percent is known. So this is almost identical to lesson 117. The only difference is that we're using percentages rather than fractions, but you know how to change percentages to fractions or decimals, so this should not be too difficult for you. All right, so the first problem is 30% of the tribe were warriors. There were 150 warriors in all. What was the population of the tribe? Okay, so what we're looking for is the tribe, the number of tribesmen. Okay, we know that 30% of the whole tribe were warriors. Okay, so I want to point out a little grammatical thing. Okay, we've already said that is means equals in math. Okay, but we also know that am, is, are, was, were are all similar, right? So we use them in different situations, but they all basically mean the same thing. They're just used at different times. So how are we going to set up this problem? Once again, we're going to translate. All right, so 30%, let's go ahead and change it to a decimal, or you could change it to a fraction. Let's just change it to a fraction just for fun. So 30 per hundredth, 30%, right, is the same as 30 per hundredth, is the same as 3/10. Okay, so 3/10 of the tribe, that's the part we don't know. So of is multiplication. The tribe, that's the number we're looking for. Were, same thing as is, warriors. Well, how many were there? There were 150 warriors. So now, how do we get rid of our 3/10? We multiply by the reciprocal. 10 over 3, 10 over 3. Okay, those cross out, and we're just left with x. All right, and that equals, well, let's cross cancel here. The 3 becomes a 1, and 150 becomes 50. 50 times 10 is 500. All right, so there were 500. I have not left myself enough room. So I'm going to go ahead and write my answer up here, I guess. Sorry about that. There were 500 tribal members. Okay, the next one is 20% of what number is 120? Well, let's change it to, let's go ahead and just use fractions again, since lesson 117 used fractions, and honestly, it's probably easier than dividing by a decimal sometimes. So 20% is 20 per hundredth. We can reduce that to 2/10 or 1/5. Okay, 1/5 of what number, that's our unknown, is equals 120. Well, now that we have our equation, we know that we need to multiply by the reciprocal to get a 1 in front of the x, and then multiply this side by the reciprocal So 5 times 120 is 600. I would like for you to do the Lesson 120 is about finding the volume of a cylinder. In order to start this lesson, I wanted to start with a cube or a cuboid because you do have a lot of experience with that. In order to find the area of a three-dimensional figure such as this, what we learned was you need to find the area of the base, that's the blue part, and multiply it by the height. Okay, and a cylinder is no different than what we've done in the past, other than the base happens to be a circle. So you just have to make sure you remember that the area of a circle is pi times the radius squared. So instead of doing any of the practice problems that are in your notes, I thought I'd make up a new one, and that is finding the volume of my coffee cup, or teacup, really, is what I'm using it as these days. So what we have to do is figure out the area of the base and multiply it by the height. All right, we already have our formula written down. Volume equals pi times radius squared times height. All right, so pi is 3.14. Radius is, well, we know that my diameter of my cup is 3 inches, so half of that is the radius, which is 1.5, which we have to square, times the height, which is 4. Okay, so the very first thing we want to do is I'm going to erase some other stuff because I'd already done a video that didn't get recorded for some reason. So we're going to erase all of this. First thing we really want to do is to square 1.5. Okay, so I'm making this more work than your actual problems in your book, but why not? So squaring 1.5 times 1.5 placeholder 0, 225, same as 15 squared, right? But our decimal point goes in there because we have 2 digits behind the decimal point. And now let's go ahead and multiply that by pi, which is 3.14. Hopefully you're doing this on your own. All right, so how many decimal points are in my problem? 4, so I have to come all the way over here. So I'm going to bring our work up to the top again, 7.065 times the height. And we have 3 digits behind the decimal point, so we need to put a decimal point there. So we find that the volume of my cup is 28.26 cubic inches. Now, what if I said round it to the nearest cubic inch? You would, this is where we want to round it to, and so this is what we have to check. Well, 2 is less than 5, so we're just going to keep it at 28 cubic inches. Once again, we could have written it that way, or we could have written it this way. They both mean the same thing. So when we were rounding, of course, we're trying to figure out, is this number closer to 28 or 29? And it's definitely closer to 29.